Long before facehuggers, chestbursters, or any Hollywood creature with a blockbuster budget, a little sci-fi show on ABC unleashed something far more unsettling. Not just because the creatures looked bizarre, but because the message underneath hit a little too close to home. This is the Outer Limits episode that made 1960s America squirm. Let's get into it. Fantasy, sci-fi, horror, rerun zone. The Zanti Misfits. By the time the Zanti Misfits premiered in December of 1963, America was already on edge. The Cuban Missile Crisis was barely a year behind us. President Kennedy was assassinated just weeks earlier, and the Cold War was casting a long shadow over everyday life. People were worried about invasion, about infiltration, about forces far bigger than themselves shaping the world overnight. Into all of that stepped The Outer Limits, a show that was doing things television wasn't supposed to do. Instead of comforting the audience, it leaned into their anxieties. Instead of giving them heroes, it handed them hard questions. And the Zanti Misfits may be the most perfect example of that. The story begins with a mysterious communication from the planet Zanti. Not a friendly hello, not a peaceful exchange of ideas. No, the Zantis have demands. They want to send a ship full of their most dangerous criminals to Earth, and they insist that Earth provides a place to contain them. No negotiation, no compromise. In fact, total destruction to anyone who invades their privacy. You could feel the tension immediately. Imagine another country telling us what to do in 1963. Now multiply that by a species we've never seen before. The Outer Limits wasn't playing around. It was asking viewers to imagine being powerless against an unknown group of aliens. The landing site? It's a desolate stretch of California desert, miles from anything. The military cordons off the area, prepares for the worst, and braces for this strange interplanetary handoff. But just as tensions are peaking, a runaway car crashes through the restricted zone. A petty criminal and a woman who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Suddenly, Earth's carefully negotiated deal with the Zantis has been compromised. Here's where the paranoia really kicks in. If the Zanti see humans as unreliable or disobedient, what will they do? Attack? Invade? More importantly, we're left to wonder, what exactly is inside that ship? When we finally get a glimpse of the Zantis, The Outer Limits does something brilliant and extremely unsettling. These aren't the tall, sleek extraterrestrials like you're used to seeing. No, these are something else entirely. Small, insect-like creatures with oversized heads, expressive faces, and those eerie, large, unblinking eyes. The Zantis were created using a mix of stop-motion animation and puppetry. Looking back, you can see the era's limitations. But in 1963, these things were nightmare fuel. They twitched, they scurried, they made these high-pitched, almost baby-like squeals, and the camera got uncomfortably close to them. ABC got very nervous. This wasn't the friendly, hopeful sci-fi they were hoping for. This was the stuff that gave kids nightmares when they tried to fall asleep at night. Once the Zantis are roaming outside their ship, everything spirals out of control. The Earth isn't holding up its end of the deal, and the criminals have escaped containment. What follows is one of the most intense and surprisingly violent sequences television had shown up to that point. Not graphic by today's standards, but for 1963, this was a lot. Guns firing, creatures attacking, soldiers panicking, families watching at home gripping their armchairs. The Outer Limits never shied away from social commentary, and the Zanti Misfits hits harder than most. In the end, the Zantis claimed they exiled their criminals because they couldn't bring themselves to perform executions. But they have no problem letting us do it for them. In fact, they were expecting it. Think about that. An alien civilization outsourcing their dirty work. It's not just another monster story. It's a story about fear, responsibility, and what people will do when they feel cornered. And of course, asking the question, who are the real monsters? When Joseph Stefano turned in his script, nobody really knew how the Zanti should look. The only direction was small, insect-like, unsettling. Easy to write, a lot harder to build. The FX team originally planned simple puppets, but Stefano pushed for something creepier. He wanted the Zantis to feel alive, in a way TV creatures usually didn't. The result was a wild mix of stop-motion animation, hand-operated puppets, and static models. Depending on the shot, you never knew which one you were looking at. The producers were worried the creatures wouldn't be scary enough. They had no idea that close-ups of those oversized, human-like faces would send kids diving behind the sofa. When the finished Zantis were brought to the ABC offices for approval, the reaction was, well, let's just say mixed. Some executives laughed. Others were genuinely disturbed. One supposedly complained they were too lifelike, which tells you all you need to know about how creepy energy these little guys had. ABC's biggest concern, though, was the violence. Not the guns, not the alien invasion, but the idea of these ant-like creatures swarming all over a grown man. They worried viewers would find it too grotesque. And to be honest, they weren't wrong. The production crew loved the Zanti designs, but boy, were they a headache to shoot. The stop-motion segments were filmed separately, sometimes late at night. Meanwhile, the on-set puppets didn't always behave the way they were supposed to. The cables would tangle, the heads would wobble, and the legs would droop. Actors had to react to creatures that weren't actually there, and Stefano often joked the cast was running from nothing, more convincingly than some later sci-fi films with multi-million-dollar budgets. The famous final sequence was the toughest challenge. The network wanted it toned down. Stefano wanted it raw. The special effects team wanted more time, and the director just wanted to get through the shot list without another Zanti falling apart. There were debates, retakes, and at one point they considered cutting the ending entirely if they couldn't make it look right. Thankfully, Stefano won that battle. The episode's message lands specifically because of that ending. Change it, and the entire story collapses. The Outer Limits was known for its narration, and the closing line in the Zanti Misfits is one of the most memorable in the entire series.
You are practiced executioners. We thank you.
But that line wasn't in the original script. Stefano added it at the last minute to make the moral of the story unmistakable. The executives felt it might be too pointed, almost accusatory. They worried that viewers would think the show was condemning human nature a little too directly. Stefano's response was basically, that's the point, and it stayed in. One more thing that often gets overlooked, those Zanti sounds. The squeals, the chittering, the frantic little noises. They were created from manipulated recordings of real insects mixed with mechanical distortions. That gave the Zantis this uncanny, unnatural presence that set them apart from the usual rubber monsters of the era. Even people who weren't frightened by the creatures themselves remember those sounds. So between a nervous network, unpredictable effects, and a story darker than primetime TV was used to, the Zanti Misfits was a gamble, one that paid off in a way that nobody expected. Of course, the real storm didn't hit until the episode went on the air. And remember, this was 1963. Network television still liked to pretend it was clean, safe, and polite. But the Zanti Misfits blew a hole clean through that illusion. Within hours of broadcast, ABC started getting calls, enough to raise eyebrows. Parents complained the episode was too frightening for younger viewers. Some said their kids couldn't sleep. Others said they couldn't sleep. The issue wasn't gore, there wasn't any. What bothered people most was the tone. The sudden frenzy of the Zanti swarming, the panic, the screaming, the way soldiers died off screen, but in ways you could clearly picture. It was all implied, and sometimes What you imagine is worse than what you actually see. That was exactly what made the show special. Years later, internal ABC memos surfaced showing exactly how worried the network had been. Multiple scenes were flagged for being deeply disturbing, especially for a show that wasn't marketed as horror. What really rattled ABC wasn't the monsters, though. Monsters, they were easy. What bothered them was the ending. It forced the audience to confront a very uncomfortable idea about human behavior. Stefano was holding up a mirror to society, and in 1963, when the Cold War paranoia was at a fever pitch, that mirror showed things people weren't ready to talk about. ABC seriously considered not re-airing the episode during summer reruns. They were afraid of more complaints, but the episode drew very strong ratings and a surprising amount of fan mail, so it stayed in the rotation, though with a quiet note that maybe the show should avoid such intensity in future episodes. Yeah, good luck with that. All these years later, the Zanti Misfits has earned something rare. These creatures weren't sleek or glamorous. They were unsettling in a way that got inside your mind. This episode was where TV grew up a little, where it stopped trying to reassure us and started daring us to confront uncomfortable truths. That ending delivered a punch that stayed with you. In a television landscape that usually played it safe, the Zanti Misfits dared to be something else entirely. Strange, bold, unsettling. And 60 years later, those little creatures still remind us that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we make ourselves. This is Rich from Rerun Zone. Thanks for watching, and good night.